So what we're going to do now is I'm going to demonstrate for you an example of how you do these steps. So my example is this. We should not legalize prostitution because to do so would be to send the message that it is acceptable to treat women's bodies as a commodity. This is an argument in the form of an enthymeme, which I've talked about before, which basically is somebody gives you a thing that they're trying to prove, and they give you a reason that they're trying to prove it, and there's almost always a reason that is left out. The reason that connects the conclusion to the reason that you're supplied. Reconstructing it. Premise: legalizing prostitution would send a message that it's acceptable to treat women's bodies as a commodity, therefore we should not legalize prostitution. What would we need to fill in here in order to connect the reason to the conclusion? To save time, here it is. We should not send the message that it is acceptable to treat women's bodies as a commodity. Very simple. So we're going to move straight to the step where you think of counter considerations, which means you think of a reason against whatever the argument is arguing for. So you can find counter considerations from your general knowledge, which is to say, this topic is prostitution. It's something that gets talked about a lot. So you can probably just, from your general knowledge, think of both reasons for and against legalizing it. In addition, you could do research. It'd be easy enough to, like, you could do that right now. I mean, like, you could just, while I'm talking, I bet one or two of you are going on like Google and looking for reasons to legalize prostitution. Or you could do more formal research by looking at academic stuff. There's a third thing you can do, though. You can think up reasons. So these are not reasons that you already know about because of your general knowledge, and they're not reasons that you look up through research. They're reasons that you come up with right now just by thinking about the issue. And that's the most fun part of the process. You probably are wondering how many counter considerations you should come up with. Well, there's no correct answer to that question. It kind of depends upon the issue. There's going to be some issues where there's like a pile of reasons for one side, like a pile of well-known reasons, and a pile of well-known reasons for the other sides. If you can like rattle off 5 reasons why prostitution should be legalized, like right off the top of your head, then I guess the correct number is 5. If it's a different topic, it's like universal basic income, and you can only think of 1 or 2 reasons, well then you're going to have to go with 1 or 2 reasons. Actually, 1 is not enough. I'm going to ask for like a minimum of 2. So if you can't think of more than 1 counter consideration, I mean, or if you can think of 0, then you're going to have to do some research to get it up to like a minimum of 2. And when you do the research, you'll probably discover that there's more than 2. But more than 5, don't do more than 5, because then it's too much work. Counter considerations. So counter considerations would be what? They would be reasons against the proposal that's being argued for. So this would be reasons to not legalize prostitution, or put more simply, to legalize it. You've probably heard arguments in favor of legalizing prostitution. Anybody want to give me one?
To help people get out of poverty.
Yes, it will help people to get out of poverty. If anybody is wondering what the connection is there, it means that it's a job, right? So it's an opportunity for people who might otherwise be living in poverty, who might otherwise, you know, not be able to make enough money to raise their kids. It's an opportunity for them to lift themselves out of poverty. That's great. Thank you. Second one, anybody?
Oh, reduction in trafficking, crime, and disease.
Yes, okay, I will write that down. Reduction in trafficking, crime, and disease. I should mention that I'm asking you for these reasons. They don't have to be reasons that you agree with or think are true. They just have to be ones that you've heard of.
Oh, then I have another one.
Great, let's hear it.
They pay taxes because now it's legal, which boosts the economy.
Okay, great. More taxes. Wait, no, that sounds terrible. Increase government revenue through taxation. Yes, like when they made alcohol legal, the government was started making money off of that. Okay, for anybody who's not clear how making prostitution legal would reduce trafficking, it's actually very easy to understand. When you make something illegal, then it has to be done in the shadows. That means that it can't be regulated, and it makes it a lot easier for crimes and abuse to take place. So that's why legalizing it would make it easier to stop trafficking. Oh, and if you're wondering, if you're not sure what the word trafficking means in this context, it basically means making people do it against their will, like coercing them into doing it, which could include children. So it's going to be easier to stop trafficking if the business is normally conducted legally, because if it's all illegal, then you're not going to get any cooperation from anybody who might otherwise, you know, who might want there to not be trafficking. Also, like with the disease, why would there be less disease? Well, because you can regulate it and you can have like rules about, I don't know, testing and condoms, but also because if something isn't done in secret, then it can be done more safely, just generally. So we have 3 counter considerations, which is a small number, but it's fine. It's totally fine. What's the next step? For each counter consideration, determine whether it is acceptable and eliminate those or not. Oh, I think I have a slide on that. So basically, in previous classes, I talked about how to determine whether or not a premise is acceptable. Normally, a premise is acceptable if it's common knowledge, obviously true, or supported by an authoritative source. I'm not going to explain those because I've already gone over them in class at least twice. We haven't actually talked about value claims yet as a loose guideline. A value claim is acceptable if it's a claim that everybody or nearly everybody would agree with. Oh, and if it's unclear what a value claim is, let's just say it's like a moral claim, like earlier, like you shouldn't tell lies. Well, that's a value claim because it's a claim about what's right or wrong in a moral sense. And most everybody would agree with that, so we would accept it. On the other hand, if somebody presents you with a value claim that you shouldn't marry somebody outside of your religion, that is not something that everybody would accept. Some people think that's true, some people think that it's not, and so it wouldn't be acceptable in a proposal argument. Another thing is that you might find that one or more of the considerations is actually irrelevant, which is to say, upon reflection, you decide, oh, actually, that's not a reason why we should legalize prostitution. Like why would you, in your brainstorming process, come up with a reason that's irrelevant? Well, because you're maybe listing all the reasons that people give, right? But then when you think about them, you go, like, wait, that's a dumb reason because it's not really relevant. So any of these claims, if you judge a claim to be irrelevant or unacceptable for like any of these reasons, then you simply remove it from consideration you delete it before you move on to the next step. Now you need to do that. You need to do the step of determining whether they're acceptable for both the counter considerations that you came up with and the ones that are already given to you in the argument. So I guess I'll go considerations, which is a fancy way of saying reasons. Reasons not to legalize PR. You know, we really should be using the word sex work instead of prostitution, because prostitution is, you know, it has like a negative connotation. It's like a biased word. Also, sex work is easier to say. But, you know, somebody who disagrees with me could say, no, 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 prostitution is the normal word and sex work is the biased term. We're not going to get into that. Okay, so this is a step where we're determining whether these are acceptable, and we have to do it for both the for and against, for both the reasons that are in the argument and for the counter considerations that you came up with for yourself. So we'll just do that one at a time. We should not legalize prostitution because it sends the message that it is acceptable to treat women's bodies as a commodity. We have some criteria for deciding whether or not we should accept a thingy.
In order to determine whether this reason or premise is acceptable, we have to first decide what kind of claim it is: empirical, conceptual, or value claim. Now, you might think that it's a value claim because it's about whether or not it's okay to do something, whether or not it's okay to treat women's bodies as a commodity. But the claim is not actually about whether the thing is okay. It's about sending a message that the thing is okay. And the question of whether something is okay is different from the question of whether we're sending the message that it's okay. Is it okay is one question, and is that the message we're sending is another question. We could answer yes to one of those questions and no to the other one. We could answer yes or no to either one, and that wouldn't affect whether the other one is true. Do you see what I mean? The question of whether we're sending this message comes down to what will people think? We do the thing, we legalize the thing, and then what happens next? What do people think? This sounds like an empirical question to me. Well, it says on the slide that an empirical claim is acceptable when it's common knowledge, obviously true, or supported by a citation from an authoritative source. It's not supported by a citation, so I think we're supposed to think that it's either common knowledge or obviously true. And by supposed to think, I mean that whoever came up with the argument, let's say it was my cat Mia, whoever came up with the argument didn't think that it was necessary to supply a citation. She thought, presumably, that people would accept it without a citation. Well, what do you think? It's not obviously true. In fact, I think it belongs to a third category that I should probably talk about. I may have talked about it before, but whether I have or I haven't, I should talk about it right now. That third category is common sense claims. A common sense claim is similar to an obviously true claim, but it's not obviously true. It might actually be something that nobody's even thought about before. But when it's pointed out to you, most people would accept it, or they think it was probably true. They'd be willing to grant it. That makes sense, is what we say to a common sense claim. Imagine that this argument comes up in a social interaction instead of as an example in a course. So I think that means you're having a conversation with my cat, Mia. That makes sense. She says, legalizing prostitution sends a message that it's okay to treat women's bodies as a commodity. Except she talks in cat language. Don't worry about that part. You respond, why do you think that? And she replies, well, it's just common sense, isn't it? Legalizing something sends the message that the government or the people think it's okay. And then you'd go, oh, I guess that makes sense. Or at least I would. Perhaps you disagree. Perhaps you think it's a mistake to think that legalizing something is sending a message that that thing is okay. Cheating on your spouse is legal, and practically nobody thinks that's okay. Or maybe you think that it's a mistake to think of prostitution in those terms at all. Maybe you think it's not about treating bodies as anything. You think it's just selling a service like any other. But, and this is what I think, legalizing prostitution, sorry, sex work, is going to send some people the message that it's okay. Or rather, that's the message that they're going to take away from it, whether or not anyone actually intends to send that message. How many people take that away from it, I don't know. But that is about the size of the effect, not whether the effect is something that will happen or not. Does that make sense?
It's, let's say, debatable whether or not this claim is acceptable. We're going to say it's acceptable for the purposes of this discussion. So then let's move on to the next one. Legalizing prostitution will help people to get out of poverty. So this is an empirical claim, and an empirical claim is acceptable if it's common knowledge, obviously true, or supported by an authoritative source. Okay, well, we don't have an authoritative source because we're just brainstorming. Could we find an authoritative source for it if we tried? Probably. I want to say that this is in the area of either common knowledge or obviously true. I mean, it just seems obviously true that allowing people to essentially have a job where their job is having sex for money will help them to get out of poverty. So I'm going to say this is acceptable on the basis that it's obviously true. Like, it would be hard to show that it's not true. Next one, reduction in trafficking, crime, and disease. So legalizing it would reduce trafficking, crime, and disease. And I already expanded on that a little bit to explain the connection. Is this common knowledge? Is this obviously true? Is it supported by an authoritative source? Okay, well, this is something that, I don't know. I want to call it common knowledge because there's plenty of research that shows this is true. All that you would have to do is you would just have to look at places where it has been legalized, and then you discover that there is there's less trafficking, crime, and disease, and just basically ends up being better in every possible way. So we're going to say that this is acceptable. We're going to accept this premise. It might be more complicated, it's more complicated than that. It's not like you legalize something and then all the problems are going to go away, because maybe you have to think about regulating it. And what about child prostitution? You're not going to be making that legal. So how is that going to affect the trafficking? But all that we're saying is it's acceptable. We're not saying this is the greatest premise ever. It's acceptable. Next, increase government revenue through taxation. Okay, this I want to say is obviously true. if you have a bunch of people working under the table and you have to work under the table, if something is illegal, then it can't be taxed. And if they don't have to work under the table anymore, then there's going to be more tax. I mean, people, some of you or some people that you know probably have jobs or have done work that was, like under the table, which means like there's no financial records of it. And why did you do it? Why did you do it? You did it so you didn't have to pay tax. So I'm putting this under obviously true. It's obviously true that if you make something legal, then you can tax it. And if you can tax it, you'll increase government revenue. And that's good for everyone. Okay, so what did we just do? I guess we just decided they were all acceptable. If we had decided that one of them was not acceptable, we would have just like removed it and it wouldn't count anymore. It wouldn't count in the next step, that next step being assigning weights. So assigning weights has to do with, it's very straightforward. It's just, one, how important is this criterion? If this criterion is a consequence, how important is this consequence happening? Also, how likely is it to happen? One of the things that you might think about in assigning importance has already come up. How many people is it going to affect? If it's going to affect 12 million people, then it's going to be more important than if it's only going to affect 12,000 people. But not everything that is a consideration is going to be a consequence. I think all of these are consequences, though. I'm reminding you, you're not supposed to add reasons to help out in support of the conclusion that you're actually criticizing, but I'm just going to write something down here as an example of a consideration that's not a consequence, because I want to talk about that. Respects autonomy of people who want to be sex workers. This is not a consequence, right? This is not like something's going to be different, but it's still a reason. Respecting people's autonomy is a value. It's important. It's like about freedom, right? The philosophy that a democracy is based upon is that people should be free to do whatever as long as it doesn't hurt other people. So if you're making something illegal that doesn't hurt other people, then you're restricting their freedom unnecessarily and you're not respecting their autonomy. So that is what this means, and that's my example of a reason, a consideration that's not about consequences. Does that make sense? You could have come up with one against legalizing prostitution along the lines of, oh, it's disgraceful to women or something like that, right? Something which, again, is not about consequences, but is about principles. And you could even interpret the one that's here as being more about principles than it is about consequences. I mean, when I wrote it as an example, I was thinking in terms of consequences. I was thinking, well, if you send the message that it's acceptable to treat women's bodies as a commodity, then that's sending the message that it's okay to objectify women, which is going to make it more likely for people to objectify women, and women are objectified enough as it is already. We don't need to encourage it. So I was thinking in terms of consequences, but you could also have thought about it in terms of a principle. It's just not acceptable to treat women's bodies as a commodity on principle, no matter what the consequences are. So that's what I'm driving at as examples of how a consideration doesn't always have to be a consequence. Moving on. Okay, so the next step is assign weights to the considerations for and against. So this means both, I want you to think about both how important they are and how likely they are to happen. Because when we're talking about consequences, and this is how I got into that whole tangent about how some reasons are consequences and how some reasons are based on consequences and some are based on principles. When you're talking about consequences, they're not usually guaranteed to happen. Like a consequence is something that's going to happen if you do the thing, which means it's going to happen in the future, but the future is never certain, right? You can't really predict the future. You can say this is probably going to happen. And that's where you need to think about the likelihood. Some people that I've taught before consider it helpful to make it quantitative, to have like these, to assign it numbers. A number between 1 and 5, where 1 is the lowest importance and also the lowest likelihood, and 5 is like it's very important and also very likely. And then you could have something in between. It may or may not be helpful. It might be more helpful for you to just think about it. Okay, I'm going to assign it a weight in terms of a number from 1 to 5, and just using my own judgment. And you might find that easier. But just in case it helps, you could. I sort of broke it down into this sort of truth table kind of thing. So number 1, low importance and low likelihood. Number 2, moderate importance but low likelihood, or low importance but high likelihood. Do you see how that works? It's just a way of assigning the numbers that consider both how likely it is and how important it is. If you find this confusing, then just don't use it. Just ignore it. Should I say a little bit more about importance? Importance has to do with things like how many people are affected, but it also has to do with things like what is the effect. So, for example, going back to increasing government revenue through taxation, well, some people might not think that that's important. They might think that for instance, reducing trafficking, crime, like, let's not, okay, no, let's change crime here. Because it's confusing to say that, well, we're legalizing something, so obviously we're going to be reducing crime, but that's not what you meant, was it? I think what you meant was reducing violence. So if like reducing the violence suffered by sex workers, which is sometimes like being murdered, is much more important than increasing government revenue through taxation. I mean, that's a normal thing to say. So that is a way of one thing is more important than another. Another way of thinking about that is, okay, increases government revenue through taxation. Well, yeah, but how much? You know, how much is it really going to affect the budget? If it affects the budget by a lot, then that reason is more important than if it affects the budget only by a small amount. And in the same way, going back to the helping people to get out of poverty, how many people will it help? Think about it this way. Let's just put it in terms of Canada. So let's say that the argument is we shouldn't legalize prostitution in Canada because blah, blah. There's plenty of prostitution already going on in Canada. I mean, we have the laws, but they're barely enforced. So if we make it legal, how much difference is it going to make in terms of putting money into people's pockets, or in terms of giving people the opportunity to get out of poverty who didn't have the opportunity before? I mean, if this is something that you're willing to do because either you're desperate or either because you actually don't mind having sex for money. There's lots of people who don't mind having sex for money. My point is, how much difference is it going to make legalizing it, right? Is it really going to be opening up doors that were not already open? We don't know. So it might not help a lot of people. And also, this is kind of speculative. So we're going to be leaning towards, I think, low importance on this one. Reduction in trafficking, violence, and disease. Well, hang on. Okay, we need to actually get this done. So help people to get out of poverty. Let's just say, well, we don't know how many people it's actually going to help. So yeah, it's a good thing, but it's not a big it's a small thing. So we're going to assign it a 1 out of 5. Okay? Again, debatable if this was like an hour ago. So for the purposes of the demonstration, 1 out of 5. Next, reduction in trafficking, violence, and disease. Okay, well, we can all agree that this is very important. The question becomes, is legalizing it going to actually have these effects, and how much? Because, you know, we very sensibly said reduction in trafficking, violence, and disease, not elimination of it, because, you know, it's not going to eliminate it, it's going to reduce it by some. How much? Well, we don't really know. I alluded to research that you could do on places where it has been already legalized and regulated. It's been widely regarded to be a good move, but it hasn't been all sunshine and roses. So I think if we assign this like a 3 out of 5, like a middling thing, as in it's very important, but how it's going to work is going to depend on the details of the legislation and whatever. So I want to say like high importance, medium likelihood. So I feel like a 3 is something where nobody's going to argue with me. Increase government revenue through taxation. Okay, well, we're sure this is going to happen. Like when we're talking about how many people is it going to help to get out of poverty, it might not be very many, but there's going to be a lot more people being taxed. Oh wait, hang on a minute. What if people decide to continue doing it under the table because they don't want to pay taxes? That's interesting. So it's definitely going to increase, there's definitely going to be some increase in tax revenue. How big is it going to be? Well, if we assigned a 3 to this one up here, then I feel like we have to assign something lower to this one. And if it sounds like I'm doing this in a very cavalier way, just as a method is just to try and get a grip on how important these things are. I mean, once you start adding it up and thinking about it in aggregate, you don't have to stick by the numbers, you know? If you come up with, if your numbers end up with something that go, oh, there's something suspicious here, it's not, you don't have to follow it slavishly. Respects autonomy of people who want to be sex workers. Yes, sure. Is that important? I don't know. See, the thing about importance, of course, is that there's a certain level of subjectivity that comes in. Like, if this was an actual, this was the question I gave you on an assignment that you got marked on, you know, you could probably tell that the correct argument, which is meaning like the correct answer, which is like the one that your professor thinks is true, is that of course we should legalize prostitution. But does that mean you would get a bad mark if you came up with a different answer? No, because this is an exercise in applying certain techniques to think about issues. It's not about getting the right answer. Anyway, so getting back to that, respects autonomy of people who want to be sex workers. Some people think that's very important. I am a person who thinks that consequences are more important. So I'm going to say this is like a 2. Oh, we forgot to assign a weight to the consideration to not legalize prostitution. Sends a message that it's acceptable to treat women's bodies as a commodity. Okay, and I said that we could think about that either in terms of what effect is sending that message going to have on society, and also in terms of as a principle. Like, we could just say, I don't care what the effects are, it's just not acceptable to send this message. So I guess in assigning a weight to it, we could think about both of those. We could just like treat it as if it was 2 different criteria and try and figure out what the weight was, looking at it both ways. Sends a message to treat women's bodies as a commodity. If we think about this in terms of effects on society, legalizing prostitution how much of an effect is that going to have on the general attitude of people in our society toward women? I would say very little. I mean, seeing as prostitution is something that happens and it has like a fairly high visibility, like you see it like on TV and all the time, and it's actually frequently like glamorized in the media. It feels like we're already sending that message, and whether or not the government makes it legal, I'm not sure how much of a difference that makes. Plus, there's always the argument that making something legal doesn't entail approving of it. It just entails that you think it's a better idea. So in terms of how much of an effect it's going to have, I'm inclined to think zero. I'm inclined to think the effect that it would have on people's actual real life attitudes toward it would be close to zero. So let's think about it in terms of as a principle. Is it just not acceptable to treat women's bodies as a commodity? Well, that sounds pretty unacceptable. But then again, when we were thinking about it a few minutes ago, we were wondering, wait, is having sex for money the same thing as treating your body as a commodity? I mean, there are a lot of things you can do with your body that you can get paid for. So keeping that in mind, just treating it as a principle, like it's questionable whether that principle even applies. Let's be generous, apply the principle of charitable interpretation, and assign it a 2. I really feel like a 2 is about as high as that's going to go, because it's unlikely to have any real life consequences, and it's not, and we're not even sure if it's actually even true. So what is that? Low importance and low likelihood. On the list that I gave, that would make it a 1. So let's be generous and give it a 2. What's the next step? The next step is the last step. Isn't that nice? The last step is where you basically add up the weights that you've given. So in favor of not legalizing it, we have 2 plus nothing, but in favor of legalizing it, we have like 1. Yeah, I am going to write this down. Show your work. 1 plus 3 plus 2 plus 2 equals 7? 8. Yes, equals 8. Now, a few minutes ago, I said that we're not going to slavishly follow the numbers, but 8 is a whole lot more than 2. But we don't want to just base it on the calculation. The calculation is like, is like a guideline. It helps you to think about it. Do we think that in aggregate, these reasons together are more important than this reason? Well, unless you think that most or none of these reasons are actually true, I feel like we would have to decide in favor of, yes, we should legalize it, because 4 reasons doesn't necessarily trump 1 reason. The 1 reason could be really important. How about this hypothetical example? Should we impose the death penalty for all crimes? You can probably give like a bunch of reasons in favor of that. Well, there would be less murder and less robbery, and people would feel safer, and like a whole bunch of reasons. But the reason against it, of course, is that we would be executing like hundreds or thousands of people that in some cases we don't even think that they did anything wrong. And that is a huge reason, right? If that was just 1 reason versus like a bunch of other reasons, we might decide that that 1 reason is more important. So it's not just a number of reasons. But in this case, the reason that's given is kind of a weak reason to begin with. And then we have a bunch of reasons where at least some of them are stronger, and certainly there's more of them. So it is really hard to come out of this procedure without deciding that we should say it's better to legalize prostitution. And therefore the argument which is what this is all about. This isn't really about should we legalize prostitution. We're evaluating an argument. The argument fails. Any questions?
Do you think you could do it yourself? I ask because you have an assignment that's due in 2 weeks where you have to do it yourself. Do. You'll have an opportunity to practice it in this week's tutorial and possibly next week's tutorial as well. That's up to your tutorial leader. If you have any questions, feel free to ask your tutorial leader or email me. The assignment is only worth 5%, so I wouldn't stress over it too much. However, you may find these techniques to be useful in preparing and writing your critical essay, which is worth considerably more, 20%, I think. I'll have more to say about that in the lecture on how to write a critical essay. And that's all I have to say.
Transform and